All right, let's go ahead and get started. I just want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We are going to be talking about the topic of teaching nonverbal and verbal skills in presentations. This is something that I think that many people may struggle with, and our students will need specific and clear guidance about this. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel for the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. A couple of points. Please make sure to mute your microphone during the main session so we don't have any background noise. If we go into breakout rooms, please, you can turn on your cameras, and this is a chance for you to discuss. If we don't have breakout rooms, we will just share in the chat box. And remember, at any time, you can ask questions or write comments in the chat box. So today's learning goal is to consider 4 aspects of verbal communication and 4 aspects of nonverbal communication, specifically when giving presentations. We'll go ahead and talk about first nonverbal communication, then verbal communication, and we'll have a chance to consider how we might implement this. Now, a little bit about me for those of you who are new. My name is Claire Lee, and I am the English Language Fellow at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. I work very closely with the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education, and I am here to provide some support for you in teaching presentations, and also for you to encourage your students to apply to the TEP-CUP contest. So we will take a moment to introduce ourselves. We can actually do this in the chat box. So please go ahead in the chat box, share your name, your school, and what emoji do you use the most. After that, you can share how do you teach verbal and nonverbal public speaking skills to your students. So for example, in the chat box, I might type my name, Claire. I will type my school name. Currently, I am not teaching at a school, so maybe I would say Tokyo Metropolitan BOE. And then the emoji that I use most is the laughing emoji. And actually, if you look at the bottom of the chat box, you can see the emoji. You can find the emoji there. So go ahead and share a little bit about yourself. And we'll go ahead and also type in, what are some ways that you teach verbal and nonverbal public speaking skills? So for example, do you have students practice in front of their peers? Do you have a checklist of the skills that they need to do? Do you include it in a rubric when you are assessing students? Do you have students practice with enunciation, making sure they're speaking loudly enough? What do you do to teach both verbal and nonverbal skills? I'll give everyone a minute to type in the chat box some of what you do, as well as share a little bit about yourself.
Claire, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I should type some things, name and school, or what is my most used emoji, and including how do you teach verbal, non-verbal. Should I put the fourth question as well?
Yes, you can type the 4th question. Sorry, I know
Okay,
I
thank you.
didn't in my example, but I can also type that. So I might say, put into rubric what I expect students to do
All right.
verbally and non-verbally.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So here's an example of what I might put. I just typed into the chat box. I like to put into the rubric when I am assessing students, what I expect students to do verbally and non-verbally. So some of those things, like I might have a point, speaks loudly enough, faces the audience, makes eye contact with audience. So what are some of the things that you focus on, and how do you actually teach those? Do you tell students they must do this? Do you have them practice in any way? And thank you for your question as well. And I'll give everyone just a minute to share their answers in the chat box. Okay, so thank you, Tawara Sensei. Oh, the smiley face emoji. I love that, especially with the teeth.
Yeah, I like this one.
That's great. It's a very happy one. Reading test twice a term. Ah, that's great. So they have to give their oral opinions and share includes oral opinion questions about the students. Okay, so they have to share about themselves, and there's a rubric. Great. I love that you are, oh, go ahead.
The topic is always related to the textbook, so I want them to speak about themselves and something related to the topic.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that makes it more comfortable for students to be able to speak when they're probably already quite nervous, right?
Yeah.
And I love to see that you've collaborated with your ALT to try and create a rubric together. I think that's a great way to utilize.
Yeah, they are very helpful. They are very kind.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. Hello, Keiko-san. Oh, I love the little smiley face with the blush, also the heart emoji. I also use the same heart emoji a lot. Great. So you specifically teach public speaking, including nonverbal skills. That's really awesome. I think that you will probably have a lot to add to this session. And I hope that you will also contribute your expertise and knowledge. I love this. So demonstrations, excellent. That's a great way to teach these skills, is doing demonstrations either by yourself or by the jets. Yeah, I think that's a great way, is we will physically show our students what we are expecting of them, and perhaps what we don't expect and what we hope they do not do. Both of those can be helpful. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Would anyone else like to share before we move on? No? All right. Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, one more. Yokoyama sensei. Oh, so cute. What a cute emoji. So you make sure to check their eye contact. Very nice. Yeah. So that's something that you can focus on and ask students to make sure to do. Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. So I'm going to talk about first the 4 verbal communication practices that I try to tell my students in public speaking. And I like having 4 and 4. It makes it easier for the students to remember what they are. So I will go over these and we can discuss what are ways that we can share this with our students. So I will share what are the 4, and then I will talk about each one in detail. The first one is volume and emphasis. Then we have pace and rhythm. Third is pauses. And finally, filler words. So these are the 4 areas of the verbal public speaking skills. Now, one thing I want you to remember is when I teach this, I'm specifically talking about with presentations or public speaking. This is not applied to daily conversation or casual conversation. We use a lot of filler words, and we may not always use pauses in the same way as we do in public speaking. So the way that we speak when we are giving a presentation is different from the way we speak when we speak to our friends or in other casual conversation. So the first area is volume and emphasis. Volume refers to how loud, right? So are you speaking very quietly like this? Or are you speaking very loudly? Right? And emphasis refers to saying certain words a little louder and longer than other words. So this is what is meant by volume and emphasis. So why is this important? Volume and emphasis help make sure that there is clarity, right? So that we can hear the presentation. It also helps make sure that the audience understands. If you are speaking too quietly, then it is really hard for example, the people at the back of the audience to understand what you are saying. Now, effective emphasis also helps support emotion, right? When we change our voice and emphasize certain words, it helps convey some emotion. It also adds variety, right? If I'm just talking like this at the same emphasis for every single word, this becomes very boring to listen to, and you don't know what is important to listen to, right? It's very hard as a listener to pick up what is the most important parts. So I like to demonstrate this with my students, right? I will actually show them, when I talk like this, then you hear me, right? But if I'm talking like this the entire time, it actually is also very distracting, right? So the point is not as a speaker to yell the entire time, but to choose what are the important words and sentences to focus on, right? So what I might do with my students to focus on volume and emphasis are some different activities like telephone, right? So I might have some students line up and they must say one sentence. I will write a sentence like, the cat jumped over the fence. And the students must whisper the sentence to the next student and see if the last student has the same sentence. They will then understand the importance of making sure that that speaking loudly and clearly is important in understanding, right? Maybe the last person will say a completely different sentence, right? So that might be something that shows the importance of volume. Now let's go on to the second area, which is pace and rhythm. Pace and rhythm refers to the speed of your speech. How quickly are you talking? Are you talking very fast? Is this too fast for people to understand? If you talk too fast, then it's really hard for the audience to really hear everything that you're saying. I actually demonstrate this with my students, and I let them know that oftentimes when we are feeling nervous, which is how many students feel when they are giving a presentation, we tend to speak faster and faster and faster. That is usually what happens. So I ask students to intentionally slow down how fast they are speaking. This also makes sure that our students understand, the audience or the students understand what is being said, right? So volume I talked about previously, right? And pausing we'll talk about in a moment, but all of these things will help with making sure that you are understood. Now, pitch and intonation refer to how high or low your voice is, the sound of your voice, right? And we can use all of these things for emphasis, to signal a transition, to build excitement, and to create contrast. Would you like this or this? Right? So notice my voice went this or this. So I made some sort of contrast there, right? When I speak faster, it's more exciting. It helps keep the energy up. Right? So I actually demonstrate these things to my students. What I might do as an activity is I will pair students together. I will give them a card that will tell them how they should speak or what I hope they will accomplish, right? So I might say on the card, for example, speak very quickly and at a high pitch, right? So I'll have them match together, and in this, I might have a reading passage, so they do not have to create this themselves. So they will read the reading passage in a high, fast pitch, right? Or I might say a low, slow pitch. I might say, make sure to emphasize important words. And so they start to practice these different ways of using their voice to create different effects. After they have read it with their partner, I want their partner to then answer, what was the effect? How did it make the listener feel, right? Did it make them feel excited? Did it make them feel bored or tired? Did it help them to understand, or did it make it more confusing? So you can mix up these different things and have students practice different kinds of speaking. And remember, it's not that one way of speaking, one pace, one pitch, one speed is better than another. It's about using them effectively. They're different tools, right? So for example, if I have a screw and I'm trying to build something, right? The tool I will need for that screw is a screwdriver, right? I will screw the driver. I'm not going to use a hammer, right? The hammer will not be the best tool. So just like a carpenter or a builder has many different tools to build, a speaker has many different tools, right? So it's not just one volume, one speed, one pitch. Okay. Any questions so far?
I have one question.
Yeah.
So, you talked about the, how can I say, some instruction to your students, and you make cards, and on the card you write about the rhythm or pitch, right? So
Yes.
the students try this activity in English or Japanese?
If it's going to be easier for your students to do it in Japanese, that's okay. The point is, like, you can have them practice in English, but it might be a little more challenging for them, right? If they are focusing on the tone of their voice, the speed, the pitch. So in order for them to maybe focus on these differences in the verbal delivery, you can have it in a Japanese passage and have the instructions in Japanese. That's okay.
Okay.
Hopefully then they can transfer that when they are doing English presentations. But really, these skills are transferable. It doesn't matter what language, right? Presentation skills are going to be the same in English or in Japanese. So you can do this in Japanese and help them to apply it when they are doing presentations in English.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Okay, the third thing is pauses. So pauses are when there's no speech, right? The space in between, the silence. Pauses are so important in a presentation or in any kind of public speaking. Why? Because they help the audience to understand and reflect. Have you ever listened to someone and they never have any pauses? And sometimes it's hard for you to concentrate or think about what they have said. This is because they haven't left any pauses. No time for you to really process and think about, what did the speaker just say? Now, pauses also help the presenter to think and to breathe. What happens when you are nervous? You tend to breathe really shallow. And also, if you are speaking without pausing, you run out of breath. When you're giving a presentation, this is not a marathon. You're not running, right? You shouldn't be out of breath at the end. So when you include pauses, it also helps you to think about, what will I say next? And relax a little bit so I'm not so nervous. And pauses also is a signal. It is a sign for the audience on the organization of the speech. When we are writing in English or writing in English, we use punctuation marks, right? Period, question mark, comma. And if we did not have that, it will be very hard for the reader, right, to understand the organization of the sentences. In the same way, pauses during a speech are the indicators of the punctuation marks. And actually, there's been a little bit of research on this. There's a specific length of time. You do not have to time this with your students, but in case you are curious, there are short, medium, and long pauses. Short pauses are 0.15 seconds, very, very short. Medium pauses are just half a second, and longer pauses are about 1.5 seconds, so a bit longer. You can have even longer pauses than that in order to give your audience some time to think and for you to think as a presenter. But these are things that are really important. So when I have students read out loud, I tell them to look at the punctuation marks and make sure that there really is a pause there, when they read out loud. This helps with reading, and then hopefully will transfer over when they are speaking in presentations. I also like to demonstrate what it sounds like when I never pause. And when I never pause, it's really hard to listen to. And I get really out of breath because I'm not stopping it. I need to breathe really fast and I start to go faster and faster. It's very hard to understand. And I show this to my students and they listen to this and it's really hard for them to think about what I've been saying. And this is right. So I actually demonstrate that to them and show them when they are not pausing at all. What does that sound like? What is that experience like for the listener? Right. Okay, and the fourth is filler language. These are words like, like, well. Now, in everyday conversation, this is very common and it is acceptable. In fact, it is a normal thing to do to have this language, and it is appropriate. If we don't have filler language in everyday conversation, actually it sounds a little bit funny, right? But in presentations, we do not want to include filler language. So if I am saying these words all the time, and it's really hard for the listener to think, right? So really instead, we have to use the art of pausing. So where you would have filler language, I actually just pause. I've trained myself, instead of saying like, I pause. So how do you get your students to notice what filler language they may have? Or even for yourself, if you are curious, I actually record myself. Or I will ask my students to record themselves practicing the speech. So if I give students an assignment, they will prepare a speech. I give them a chance to practice the speech, and I ask them, record yourself doing this speech. This may be audio, or it can be video. I like video because then the students can also watch any nonverbal behaviors that are distracting. But what I then do is then say, okay, now watch that video or listen to the recording. Listen for, do you pause? Is there filler language? What filler language do you use? Usually we have some preferred words for filler language. And one time, for example, I was listening to a presenter, a student of mine, and they would say, well, a lot. I actually counted. I put a check mark, tick, 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 tick. And then at the end, I said, did you notice that you said well a lot? And I said, actually, you said it 15 times in the presentation, right? I'm not going to do this in front of the class. I told the student one-on-one to not embarrass them. But that brought some awareness. Oh, this is a word I use a lot. Okay. Another way to avoid filler language is to rehearse organized phrases. What I mean by this is not memorize your entire speech. This is not what I'm saying. But when you have certain phrases and words that you are practicing with different parts of your presentation, it helps you to know what is coming next and what you might say next so that you can avoid the filler language. So once again, not saying you should memorize the presentation, but choosing certain words or phrases that you might say with each slide is something that I will encourage my students to do. In addition, we all know that when we practice, we tend to reduce the filler language because we are more confident and we don't need to pause and think about, what am I going to say next? So question, which of these skills do students struggle with and which ones do they do well? So let me just go back to the slide with all of them. So please type in the chat box which ones are students good at and which ones they need to work on. So for example, some students that I have worked with are really good at volume. But they might have a lot of filler words. So I will give everyone a minute to share in the chat box. What are the things your students do well? What do they need to work on? You can also say they do all of these well, or maybe all of these are areas they need to work on. Okay, so let's see. Some of the things we see are that pace and rhythm are good. That's great. Great to hear, Coyote Sensei. Not familiar with reading or speaking in English, so pace and rhythm is difficult. Wow, so interesting. So it depends on the students, right? What their strengths and weaknesses are. Filler words, yes, that can be quite difficult. Even for native speakers, it is very difficult to avoid filler words. So pace and rhythm may be challenging. They tend to pronounce monotonously like Japanese. Wow, that's a really good observation. Japanese tends to be have less stress on certain words. English is a very stress-focused language. Where you place the stress changes the meaning, right? Some students are okay with volume and pace. Yeah, of course, it depends on the student, and every student is different. Great, thank you so much for sharing. I hope that that gave you an opportunity to think about how to focus on the verbal aspects of public speaking. Any questions before we move on? Great. Well, let's go on to the 4 nonverbal communication skills. I just want to mention that there are so many different areas of verbal and nonverbal communication, but I have just simplified it down into the 4 and 4 to make it easier for students and for you to remember. We can talk about 100 different skills for nonverbal and verbal communication, but these may be some of the more important ones that it is important to focus on. So the 4 areas are eye contact, gestures, movement, and posture. So let's go through each of these. Eye contact. Now, one thing I want to mention about this is obviously this depends based on culture. In some cultures, eye contact is very important and it's a sign of respect. In other cultures, eye contact shows defiance and is disrespectful, right? But in general, when you are giving a presentation, it is good to make eye contact. Of course, this may be different based on the culture that you are in. So the first thing is to face the audience. One thing I notice a lot with students, especially if there's some slides or presentation, is, ta-da, I am going to read this slide here and speak this way, and all you see is the back of my head. So I make sure that students are facing the audience. I also let them know that they can scan the audience, 3 to 5 seconds per person, if that is, if I want to be really specific. I also let them know that they should not just stare at one person in the middle of the room or at their notes. Now, where are you speaking? You're just speaking down, right? You're not actually, that will affect the volume and how people can understand you. One tip that I give my students is that if they are having trouble or feel shy and don't want to look people in the eyes, I say try to look at their forehead, their shirt, or just above their head. This may help if you are feeling nervous. So with eye contact, I mention this to students, and when they are practicing with each other, I tell them to notice, did the presenter make eye contact with you? And to give that feedback. The second part, I think I've noticed that especially in Japan, this can be more challenging, is gestures, right? So and this is just my simple observation. This is of course not everywhere in Japan, but the tendency is that students or speakers will stand very still behind the podium, right? And they will stand there and not move, no gestures at all, and they're very formal. That's to show some formality, right? But gestures can really help with understanding in the presentation. And by gestures, I don't mean just moving your arms around and moving around for the sake of moving. I ask students to focus on the movements that will add substance to the speech. I also ask students to reduce any unnecessary movements like fidgeting or repetitive movements, crossing arms, or the hands in the pocket. I've noticed that the Japanese students do not tend to do this, but other students I have taught may have some difficulty and need more awareness around this. So, how do you add movements and gestures that are going to be meaningful? I actually give my students some examples, right? I tell them you can compare two ideas, right? So Japan versus the US, right? Let's see, I'm trying to think of another example. Tea versus coffee, right? So when I do this, I am showing there are two ideas, concepts, things that I am comparing. Okay. Other things I might do is with a straight arm, I might point to the slide to bring attention to the slide. If there is something important I really want my audience to listen to or see, right? This is something that I might do. That is also a gesture, gesturing to the visuals. Or if there's like a graph, for example, or a picture, I might point to a specific thing in the graph or picture. Other ways to add gestures is if I am giving a list, I count off my fingers, right? So I have done in this presentation already, right? Four nonverbal skills, 4 verbal skills. Right? One thing to note, this is a little bit more about cross-cultural differences. The way that people count on their fingers is very different based off of the country. So for example, in Japan, how do you say 6? Like this, right? Actually, in America, we say it like this, 6. So the way to count may be different, but of course, they can count however they feel comfortable. So there are many different things. I can also talk about the future, and I like to gesture forward, or the past, behind me, right? So these are all things that I will add as gestures, and I will actually show my students these things. Now, how do I help my students to add this into their presentations? When they are working on their speech and their slides, I will give them a moment and say, read through your speech, and I want you to circle the areas where you would like to add a gesture and think about what gesture that will be. So maybe they are circling the part where they are numbering off, right? Maybe they are circling the part where they are comparing two things. And by actively adding that in and thinking in advance, what gestures will I do? It will hopefully help them to add that in when they are doing their speech. During that time, while students are individually looking at their speeches or their slides or their notes, I may come around and give some suggestions to my students about what nonverbal skills to add. Questions so far? Okay, let's move on to the third aspect, which is movement. Now, what I mean by movement, because gestures are also movement, is literally moving around, right? So the tendency can be to just stand behind the podium and never move at all. Depending on the context, this may be okay and appropriate. For example, you do not see the President of the United States moving around the stage. He does not move around the stage. He stands behind the podium. It's very appropriate, and that is what he should be doing. However, some presentations are more engaging when there is movement. This includes for the TEP-CUP. There should be some movement. The student should not just stand behind the podium. You want your students, for some presentations, to move around the front of the classroom or the stage. But this does not mean just pacing back and forth. You are not just, walking around, getting your steps in, right? And you don't want to rock your body or move around like this. I like to make the suggestion, if you're not sure how much to move around, every 2 to 3 minutes is a good amount. Another time when you can move is when you're transitioning from one idea to the next. So it's a very visual way of showing by moving from one side to the other, you're now changing ideas and topics. Remember, when you are moving, be careful to not block any visuals. So you can see in this picture, maybe this woman is actually blocking some of her presentation slides. So we want to be aware of that. Now, the final aspect of nonverbal communication for presentations is posture. Posture is how you hold your body and your feet. These are some suggestions for what might be appropriate for presentations, including a straight back, level chin, keeping the feet hip-width distance apart and knees slightly bent. I also remind students they should not be leaning on an object like the podium or the desk, right? So these are some things that I mentioned before, asking students to record a video of them practicing their speeches. Why? To listen to filler words. But they can also use the same video to look for these 4 things in nonverbal communication, right? They can notice, do I have my hands in my pocket? Am I looking down at my notes? Am I leaning on something? Am I too still? Do I have meaningful gestures? These are all things that they can watch the video and notice. That's what I've done before with my own videos. I get really, I watch it and I'm like, oh, I can't believe I did that, right? But it's a great way to bring awareness and reflection. So what I might do is I will ask students to record them practicing. Then I will give them a checklist, right? The checklist of the verbal and nonverbal aspects. So are you standing straight? Yes. Are you looking at the audience? Yes. Are you adding movement? Yes. Do you have meaningful gestures? Oh, no, I don't have that, right? So they can make a checklist, watch it, and fill that out. All right. So now that we've looked at the nonverbal skills, which of these skills do students struggle with and which ones do they do well? Sorry, let me go ahead and... Yes. So the 4 were, remember, eye contact, gestures, movement, and posture. What are things that they do well already? What are things that they need to work on? So for example, I might say something like, my students that I've had before, they're usually okay with posture, but maybe they need to just add gestures. Okay, so you'll add into the chat box. Okay, let's see what we have. A few answers. Eye contact is good. That's great to hear. But students are easily moving back and forth or leaning on the desk. Yeah. Something that they may not even notice that they are doing, right? Until someone brings awareness or they watch the video and see that they're moving like this. Usually that's out of nervousness, right? Or leaning on the desk. Okay, eye contact is good. Great to hear that. Yes. I think eye contact is something that is very well known as a part of nonverbal communication that is important. Yeah. Anything else? How are gestures for your students? Yeah, very important point. Genki sensei. Yeah, gestures is not a part of Japanese culture. That's right. And so that's why gestures are not often used, right? I think that's an important cultural difference. And we want our students to be flexible and be able to culturally adapt, right? So they need to know when is the appropriate time to use gestures, when is not the appropriate time. And so you make a very, very important point that in Japanese cultures, it's not used, right? And so that is something that may be a barrier because they have been taught for a very long time, do not use gestures. Yeah. Excellent point. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. I just wanted to share the references for today's session. And we have a few more minutes, and so I want to give everyone a chance to, if you have any questions. Okay, I have another comment here. A few students try to use gestures. That's great. I love that they are really trying, even though it may be something that is new to them or different to them. Yes. So it can be something that when they are giving presentations in Japanese, there is a different nonverbal style than when they are giving presentations in English. And that is something that you can directly talk about with your students, how this is a cultural difference. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for all of your time. I really appreciate it. I know you are all so busy. I hope that this was a helpful session. Please go ahead and are there any questions? We have a little bit of time.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if it's not too difficult to show us, I'm interested in power poses in the last slide.
Ah, yes, I didn't really
What are
talk
power
about that.
poses?
Yes, yes, yes. Sorry, I skipped over that aspect, but this is something that I think is a really interesting research that came out of Dr. Cuddy. So, power poses. Now, Dr. Cuddy researches body language, and she noticed that there are certain poses that will help to build confidence. These are poses you do before the speech, not during the speech. So the first one, command space. This can be for a speech or a meeting or anything like that, right? Or a contest. But she notices that when people have their arms out like this helps to command the space, and it internally makes you feel more confident. So she did this research and she noticed this correlation, right? And so actually, when we're nervous, for example, we tend to curl up, our breathing gets fast. But it's the other way around too. We can also influence our mental state by how we hold our body. So commanding the space, asserting importance. I'm sorry, you can't really see what I'm doing, but asserting importance and feeling comfortable. These are all poses that she recommends. You can do it for 30 seconds to 1 minute before the presentation, meeting, competition. And this will actually boost your confidence and your mood. We may see someone who has this pose. What kinds of people usually do we see have this pose? Maybe police officers. right? Or security. And they are, or military, they are trained to do that for a reason. Why? Because they are showing some confidence in their body language. And they are also feeling more confident and having more of a presence. So yes, does that help answer your question?
Yes, a lot. Thank you very much.
Great, yeah. She has a TED Talk, which you can watch, and I'm happy to send that TED Talk as well in the email you will receive after this session with the PowerPoint slides and the material. So if you have time, feel free to watch that, but she shares about her research and how it has, how body language impacts our confidence. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your time. I really appreciate it. If there are any other questions, please feel free to email me and ask questions. All of this material, all of this information is free for you to use. And if you have any comments, questions, please always feel free to reach out. Thank you again, everyone.